You're listening to Liberty Buzzard with Dustin Hammett and Thomas Umstattd Jr.
So let's pick at the news like a couple of buzzards along the side of the highway. What's first on our...
Well, I think you and I were going to talk about dealing with haters. Both of us have created viral blog posts, and I think both of our viral blog posts were relatively innocuous, and yet we still have people commenting with hate, and I just find that fascinating. And I know you did a recent interview on another podcast, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on dealing with haters.
Yeah, so my post was less innocuous than yours was, because I was telling a whole community of people that the way that they are doing relationships is wrong. So,
yeah, you were giving relationship advice. I'm pretty sure yours was way more charged than mine.
Yes. So I was telling a bunch of conservative Christian homeschoolers that courtship doesn't work, and giving some really good arguments, and that I stole/borrowed from my grandmother, who'd been giving those arguments all along. I just hadn't been listening to her, and it set the internet on fire. I got 1 million page views in just a matter of weeks, and somebody did a series of blog posts critiquing mine. So my blog post was why courtship is fundamentally flawed, and somebody wrote a blog post, why courtship is not fundamentally flawed, part 1 of 8 or 1 of 7, and then
you
the next week is part
passion.
2 of 7. It was like, man, this person is really, really passionate about this. So yeah, it was an interesting. It happened a long time ago, so I don't talk about it that much, but I went on this podcast to talk about it, and a lot of people apparently had forgotten about how vitriolic all of the drama was around the blog post in the early days. So I've been getting lots of feedback on my podcast episode where I talk about how to deal with haters. And but you wrote an article about the Austin Police Department. What happened with that?
Well, it wasn't so much an indictment on the Austin Police Department itself. It was just more of my decision to leave the world of policing, the various reasons that I did. And most of the reception I got was pretty positive. I mean, I laid out my personal reasons for leaving, and what I came in about the job, what I was excited about the job, and then ultimately why I left and the politics surrounding that. And most people agree with me, but there's just was a couple who took my personal decision as an indictment on their own choices and got really, really mad about it. And this guy's a moron, doesn't know what he's talking about. He only did 4 years on the job, this, that, the other, blah, 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 blah. And I just found it very interesting. I was surprised when the thing went viral anyway. I didn't think anybody would read it. And but then B, I guess I just got surprised that so many people got angry about my own personal decisions. So I guess they just got offended. But,
It's one rule of the internet. If you do anything that anyone pays attention to, people are going to get offended. Getting offended is the new national pastime because it gives you so much power. If you can become offended about something, it gives you power over somebody else's life, somebody else's words, somebody else's clothes, somebody else's behavior. It's really like nothing right now in society gives you as much of power over someone else than being offended. So we really reward and encourage fragile people who get offended by lots of things.
That's the truth. And the internet age, we all get to voice our opinions. It's like back in the good old days, Thomas, back before computers. The little old lady would come across from the restaurant and criticize you about the clothes you were wearing, and that was basically that would happen once in a lifetime maybe. But now you post something on the internet or Twitter or Facebook or something like that, and all the world can tell you how screwed up you are. And so the double-edged sword that is mass communication of the internet age. Speaking of that,
fragile people, mass communication. Let's talk about the Huffington Post. Speaking of snowflakes,
yeah. So you and I were talking about the internet, and I was explaining to you how the Huffington Post, a reporter named Luke O'Brien from the Huffington Post, doxed. For those of you out there who are listening to this who don't know what doxing is, that basically means that someone who doesn't like you is going to find out all of the information about you, name, birthday, address, all the addresses of your family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and put it out there for the internet world to consume and potentially to take action on. So if you have somebody that's passionate enough about what you said, I think the danger therein lies that they could come and attempt to physically harm you in some way because they know everything about you. Or they could do like Anonymous does and order 1 million pizzas off your credit card information. So that's doxing. So Huffington Post, they've been known to dox people with whom they disagree. It's one thing to dox somebody who's a public figure who has a lot of Twitter followers, Facebook friends, what have you, and constantly goes out there and makes inflammatory statements. So the individual in question, which Luke O'Brien doxed, Amy Meck, said a lot of hateful stuff about Muslims. She obviously doesn't like Muslims. But the problem, I don't think anybody has a problem with him doxing Amy Meck. The problem was the fact that he doxed her entire family, which all came out and said they don't agree with her. So her father's business, her brother's business all suffered because the Huffington Post reporter came out and said they all existed and this is what they do. Never really gave them an opportunity to comment on it, and all of a sudden their businesses on reviews on Yelp, etc., are getting a lot of 1-star reviews from San Francisco and places that are nowhere close to where their actual business is, just because this Huffington Post reporter reported on them. So I brought this news story to your attention just because I felt like it was really inappropriate. Especially for a national news organization for Huffington Post. I know you're big in the internet world and are familiar with doxing, Thomas. What do you think about all that?
Yes, this is a kind of troubling escalation in the war of ideas, because doxing is as close as you can get to actual violence with just words. And the reason why it's so concerning, especially when you dox a woman, is that they have crazy people on the internet who will go after them and invade their homes. I've read a lot of biographies of people like Felicia Day who have been doxxed and had somebody try to break into their home, and the amount of fear that puts them in on an ongoing basis. Because if you're famous, right, 1 out of 1 million people is an absolute monster, right? Maybe more. You were a cop, you probably have a better idea of what the percentages are. But if you're somebody like the Huffington Post and you give somebody's personal address to millions and millions of people, there are a lot of rapists, there are a lot of sociopaths in that population who now have the ability to do violence and feel justified in doing that violence. Like, oh, well, this person is someone I disagree with, therefore I can do violence against them and it's okay morally, which I disagree with that whole moral or ethical framework, but it makes sense in their head, perhaps, and that's what they use to go after this person. That's really scary and totally unjust to punish somebody for something they didn't do. Like, let's say this woman has a brother who has nothing to do with what she's saying on Twitter. Why should he be punished? Why should he lose his job because of what his sister says? That's also really scary. And strength invites strength. If you raise the stakes, you have to be okay with the stakes being raised against you. And that escalation, I think, is pointing us in the wrong direction as a country. I don't want to see a civil war. And the people at Huffington Post definitely don't want to see a civil war because they've alienated everyone with guns. The police don't like them, the military doesn't like them, and the gun-toting, rednecks don't like them. It's not a good place. So I think for them to escalate is a big mistake.
Yeah, and I think the hardest thing about this is the fact that when you try to assassinate someone's character, that's bad enough at all. But when you go beyond that, and you go for their family as well, that's crossing a pretty big line. It's one thing if it's a public figure who's out there making their own statements, but when you start going after their family, you've crossed a big line. And I hope it comes in the near future, because I find this, it's a dishonorable act. And I'm one of those old-fashioned people who believes in the notion of honorable things and things like decency. And I hope it gets quashed somehow in the civil courts. I don't think it's necessarily around for the criminal courts yet, but I hope in the civil courts it gets people, or the organizations like the Huffington Post. What do they listen to? They're going to listen to money, and so I hope it comes to that soon, just because I think it's so incredibly inappropriate.
There used to be an understanding in American politics that you don't go after people's family. And Republicans have been the worst at honoring that. So back in the 90s, Republicans would go after Hillary Clinton a little bit, and that was like, well, she's kind of political, maybe you can do that. But then they started going after Michelle Obama and Obama's kids, which was worse because suddenly the children are targets, and that's completely unacceptable, at least in most people's eyes. And then Trump started not just attacking the politics, but also attacking the looks of the wives of the people he was running against. So he attacked Ted Cruz's wife's, and basically called her ugly on Twitter and got everyone talking about it and comparing who's got the prettier wife. And it's like, that is really obnoxious, and that's a really terrible precedent to set. And as Republicans, I'd like to think that Republicans have a better sense of honor than that, a better sense of decency, that they wouldn't put up with that kind of bad behavior from their own people. And they're very quick to criticize if somebody, attacks Melania Trump. They rush to her defense like, how dare you attack her for her accent, to the fact that she, English isn't her first language. And it's like, hey, that knife's got to cut both ways. You can't only stand to Melania's defense and not stand to Michelle Obama's defense. And I will give props to Chelsea Clinton. I don't know much about Chelsea's politics, but what she makes the news for the most often is that she has one issue that she holds to regardless of who's in office, and that is, don't go after the president's kids, which, I get it, right? She was a president's kid. She knows what that's like. And so when Trump's young son gets attacked, one of his most strident defenders is Chelsea Clinton, who is yelling at the left for what is a inappropriate conduct. And I think that that's good that she does that, because I think we need to have some decency in this country. We need to have some sense of fair play. We can't be at war with each other and breaking kind of the rules of engagement, so to speak.
And I guess that's the biggest lesson. It, like you said, double-edged swords. We can't necessarily regulate decency because we have the freedom of speech, and freedom is hard. And freedom of speech is really hard because that means jerks get to be jerks. I mean, I'm as a police officer, I had to explain that all the time. Being a jerk is not against the law, which, sometimes is really hard to bear. But that's just the way it is. And taken as a whole, Thomas, people are jerks. I mean, that's especially when they're hiding behind their keyboard and there's no face-to-face repercussions. People can be pretty bad jerks.
Yeah, and I don't want any laws against this. I think that's even scarier than the act itself. I want us to police ourselves. If you're a Republican and you want some decency in public discourse, you should demand decency from the people who are listening to you. So demanding that Democrats are decent, that's no good because they don't listen to you. You need to demand that your fellow Republicans are decent. And if you're a Democrat, don't demand that the Republicans are decent. Demand that the Democrats are decent. Like, clean up your own house, pull the log out of your own eye before you try to help somebody else with the speck that is in their eye.
Well, I think that's a great notion, Thomas. Unfortunately, my faith in humanity is low. That's just the way it is, unfortunately. That's just the reality of life. I don't think any of us can be too shocked when politicians are Machiavellian and ultimately hypocrites. I certainly am not floored when I learn that a politician's a hypocrite. So I don't know. That's just the way it is. I don't have a solution. Just I think ultimately, when bring it back to the doxing thing, I think there will be hopefully not particularly a law put against it, although I can see that happening as well if it gets too bad. But definitely some type of civil litigation, some type of something like that, which will make these companies stop that.
Speaking of haters and doxing, at Apple's WWDC, the Worldwide Developers Conference this year, they opened with a video that compared developers to like a herd of wild animals. It was very strange. And I was like, this is the sort of thing that you really have to be careful with. Because the whole point of WWDC is it's a conference for developers, celebrating developers, educating developers, and to compare them to animals. I'm like, this is a really high-risk gambit. I'm curious how developers reacted. One interesting thing is that it's easier to make fun of people who are secure in who they are. And the kind of developers who are at WWDC are changing the world, making lots of money. They're the kings of their universe and queens of their universe, so to speak. So perhaps they weren't offended, but I was like, there are a lot of groups of people that you could not do this about. Like if you do that about homeschoolers or any sort of ethnic group, you'd be in a lot of trouble. But they did have some interesting announcements of what's coming in the future for Apple owners. So I realize most people who listen to podcasts are Apple owners because Android people are in general not podcast listeners, which makes me sad and makes them gives them less access to information. Definitely
filthy
gives them
animals.
Access to no. Hey, we just talked about raising the level of civil discourse. So
Thomas, it's interesting because if I get a platoon of Marines out here and I tell them that they're a bunch of wild animal, filthy beasts, that's a compliment. So I guess it all depends on your audience.
That's right. Marines don't die; they just go to hell to regroup.
That's right.
So, yeah, but again, if you think about a pack of Marines or a group of Marines, they are very secure in who they are, right? I couldn't think of many groups that are more confident than Marines.
Some might say overconfident.
Yeah, well, that's the whole appeal, though. The whole point of the marketing and the positioning is if you want to be around a bunch of other confident hoorah guys, join the hoorah core. So, but anyway, back to the developers and nerd stuff. So a couple of cool features coming down. One, there's been this big scandal with Apple about them making new versions of the operating system make the phones slower. And from time to time, and Apple did this once with OS X when it came out with Snow Leopard, they came out for a whole year. The new feature was that there was no new features. They just made things faster. And this is a process called refactoring, where you go through your code and you optimize it to make it faster. And it sounds like that's what they're doing in iOS 12, which is desperately needed. I don't know if they've ever done this in iOS, but their promise is that this is going to make your phone run faster. So, apps are going to launch between 40% faster and 70% faster, or like taking photos is going to be 70% faster. And it's going to run on all of the phones that iOS 11 ran on. So this will actually be an upgrade. So normally when you download the new version of iOS, your phone gets slower. And that's
why
not
I
an
never do
upgrade,
it.
It's a downgrade. So, but you need to do it for like security reasons, right? Like your phone becomes vulnerable to hackers. And I feel like this is the only good thing that Apple could do in this context. They could continue denying it, but after the whole battery gate controversy, I don't feel like they really had the right to do that because they ended up having to throttle people's phones because they're draining the batteries too much because the code was just too inefficient. So that's the big exciting news. The other thing is that they're coming out with Memojis. I don't know if you heard about this, but you can now make a avatar of your own face, kind of like what Yahoo had back in the day, but with tongue detection. So when you make a animated emoji, you can stick out your tongue at somebody, which I'm sure is
great. So our society is going to turn out into a bunch of people with tongues hanging out of their faces.
Well, the phones at least can detect if your tongue is hanging out of your face, which,
I look forward to walking
somebody
down
worked
the
hard
street
on that feature.
and having a bunch of people doing selfies with their tongues hanging out of their face. Just so I get captured for the Memoji.
That's right. One other cool feature, and Google announced something similar to this in their Google I/O conference a few weeks ago or a couple months ago, but they're reducing drug mode in the phone. So what do I mean by that? Phones have been up to this point designed scientifically to be addictive. The games especially, but even other apps and other elements. There's gamification, which is the science of making it addictive. And the result has been...
Does the DEA know about this?
The DEA only cares about drugs that compete with the drugs that the rich drug companies make money selling. Although, actually, the studies do show that if somebody's playing a video game after surgery, they require half as much painkillers because of how powerful video gaming is when it comes to mitigating pain.
Oh, crap. Phones are about to be a Schedule III drug.
Like,
hide your iPhones, kids!
You're going to have a prescription for that iPhone. Only the iPhone 6 is available over the counter.
We're going to have to get that black market iPhone. I'm going to have to call my iPhone dealer.
So anyway, Apple's adding a mode where you can set limits. So you're like, I'm putting a 30-minute limit on myself on Facebook so that it gives me a 5-minute warning. And then as I'm running out of time, it says, okay, time to do something else, which I think is a really solid strategy. It helps you kind of monitor how much time you're spending on your phone, because it can be really hard. You know, you download a super addictive game like Clash of Clans, and you think you're spending 30 minutes on it, when in reality you spent 2.5 hours on it, and that time just got sucked out of your life. It's kind of like that machine in Princess Bride. It's like, I've just sucked one day of your life away. Tell me, how do you feel? And remember, it's for posterity, so do be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. I call that Saturday.
So anyway, I'm excited overall about the new direction for iOS. They made a few Mac OS announcements, but nothing that was particularly exciting. I really want better search. The search on my Mac is not great, and they keep not improving that. They have a dark mode, which is very exciting for developers. Anyone who spends a lot of time staring at their screen, you can make it darker, which is easier on your eyes, and maybe will help you sleep better at night. But yeah, overall, there was no hardware. So no new phones, no new watches, just new software for the phones and watches that already exist. But that's a quick recap of Apple's WWDC.
I'm just waiting for the day that they have a microchip that I can implant on my head so that my thumbs don't hurt anymore when I'm operating my iPhone. I can just think.
Get you some Google Glass.
You know, I call it my brain anyway, so why does I go ahead and just put it into my brain and just make it all easier for myself? And then I can learn how to speak Chinese finally.
There you go. Get that little babblefish. You put it in your ear and you hold out your phone. So when it talks into your phone, you hear it in perfect English. We're moving in that direction. It'll be interesting if we ever get there all the way.
Well, I'm sure we will one day, Thomas. I'm sure we will one day.
All right. Thank you for listening to Liberty Buzzard, where we pick through the news along the highway of American culture.